I wanted to be a lot of things, but the first thing I ever said I wanted to be was an artist, like way back when I was, I don't know, like 6 or 5 or.
Welcome to Artists and Offices, a podcast that explores, through interviews with working artists, the idea that the work you do for pay supports the work you do for love. Or does it? I'm your host, Rebecca Bird Grigsby, visual artist, crafty generalist, and dance enthusiast. Having quit my full-time day job in 2017, I'm currently a recovering artist in offices, rebooting my studio practice while trying to figure out my next career move. Each episode of this podcast explores the perspective of an individual artist juggling their creative practice with their day job. In episode 5, I talked to Brooklyn-based artist and archivist Janine Biunno.
My name is Janine Biunno. I'm 36 years old. I live in Brooklyn, New York, and I work full-time as an archivist. And when people ask me what I do, I usually say I'm an artist and an archivist, which is like a little bit of a tongue twister. I often am asked to repeat myself. Whatever. I always liked art. I always was good at art. It was something that I was very conscious of as a kid, that I was usually like the best at drawing in my class. Obviously, art became, a much bigger thing as I took studying it more seriously. But even as a little kid, I really enjoyed it and knew that it was something that I had, an affinity for. My family was pretty supportive. It was interesting because they obviously, cared that, especially as I got older and it became more and more clear that it was something I wanted to pursue more seriously and what I wanted to study in college. And there was some concern about just how are you going to turn this into a living, which I think a lot of parents whose kids go to art school are like, what are we signing up for? Especially in my family, no one's an artist. This is so foreign to them. So, but my family was supportive because I think they just sort of trusted that I was going to somehow land on my feet. They were pretty keen on, if I was going to study art, that I was doing it in a big university and not at an art school specifically, at least not for undergrad. And I think that was actually a really good call because it let me do a lot of more interdisciplinary work and understand where art can fit contextually among other sort of disciplines. So I'm really glad that I did that. But more or less, they kind of let me do my thing. And even when I was and I'm going to get an MFA now, they were like, sure. I think because I thought at that point I really wanted to be a professor. And I was at that point not yet really attuned to the realities of academia and what it meant to commit to that path. And also with the student loan that I was taking on, that I couldn't afford to be an adjunct, which was really the only thing that would have even been remotely possible for me when I finished my MFA. So I haven't totally abandoned the idea of teaching at some point. It's something that's still sort of ruminating, but it's something that I had to let go of, especially towards the end of my time in grad school. And I realized it pretty early, actually. I think within my first year of our MFA program, I was like, this is not what I'm going to end up doing, at least not right now. That basically led me to sort of examining what else I was doing in my life and what other things I could do that were sort of adjacent to art, where I could sort of still feel like I was active in the art community, but maybe not necessarily working super directly in either teaching art or assuming that I was going to make a living as a practicing artist. It's something I never expected to do, nor do I think I ever will. I don't know. It's just something that I don't anticipate for myself. I don't know why. But anyway, at the point that I came to this realization in grad school, I was working at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston as a digital imaging specialist in their collection management department. And I was basically using digital imaging skills that I acquired in college at the dawn of Photoshop. I was one of the first classes at Carnegie Mellon that ever was able to take a digital imaging class. So I learned a lot about using those tools. And this was around the time, it's early 2000s, a lot of museum collections were starting to digitize. And I can talk a lot more about that, but I was basically working at the MFA to help digitize a lot of their collection management materials and some primary documents in two different departments. I realized between sort of my digital imaging skills and my sort of chronically organized nature, which not to generalize, there's plenty of artists that have really systematic and like rigid practices. To be a good printmaker, you need to be so organized, and that's sort of par for the course. So, but I realized that this was actually, it was a good thing. And while it wasn't something that I automatically associated with, someone being like artistic by nature, it's me to a point. So I was like, there's something to explore here. And that's when I realized that Tufts also offered a museum studies program. So I went ahead and completed graduate certificate in museum studies at the same time as my MFA, because I figured I could sort of parlay it into some sort of collections management or archival work or something along those lines. Since I had just before I started that program, I'd been sort of privy to some of the inner workings of the museum. I realized there was a place for this, and that there was also a lot of movement happening in collections starting to digitize and transfer their holdings, So I was like, okay, well, at the very least, there's something for me to do here, and I'd like to organize stuff. So we're good. That sort of is what led me to my current career path. But I've managed to always sort of work, and I've been fortunate in this regard to always be able to work, whether in studios or at institutions that were tied into art or design or architecture. And my work being about architecture and the built environment, I was really excited to also work on that side of a creative field and not just in like fine arts in particular.
Yeah. So, I mean, it sounds like you've been I can see the sort of synergy between all these things, but I think it sounds like you've been fairly practically minded and kind of strategic in like the jobs that you've taken on while, studying and while just making your artwork. Were there any past jobs that you had that deviated from that at all? Like, were there jobs that you had either as an undergrad or in between undergrad and grad school that were just kind of like wild card jobs?
Yeah. Oh my God. I've always been pretty strategic in trying to make sure that I was at least doing something, albeit part-time, whatever, that was tied into something sort of practically minded in like the art institutional world, whether I was like working at a gallery or something like that. But, or like even working at an art store. But I delivered food in between undergrad and grad school. I worked as a cater waiter. Like I've done a lot of that type of stuff too. But I often did that as a way to sort of supplement me doing the things that I found were more focused into like my long-term goals. So if I was, part of the time helping, work at a gallery and working at a museum and doing like a few other little part-time art things that paid nothing, if at all, which again is another frustrating aspect of like getting your, grounding yourself in the art world, is that so much of it is, I feel like a lot of it is changing now. Because it's been brought to the spotlight so much, but the expectation that you're just going to work for free. And it keeps a lot of privilege in the art world and in institutions where people are able to either work for nothing or little to nothing because they're not reliant on the actual income. So I don't know, somehow I managed to sort of keep on pushing through whether or not I had to take on a bunch of part-time jobs or not. And eventually it did pay off into a full-time gig.
I met Janine in 2005 at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, where we were both pursuing our MFA degree. At the time, the program consisted of 2 years of coursework, followed by a semester or two to complete and exhibit your MFA thesis. The program is no longer structured this way, with the MFA thesis presented by all second-year students at the end of the second year.
Well, we were in we had our thesis early. We were in the early thesis group. And in some ways that was great because it left that last semester of grad school, things were pretty much done. So I was able to focus on teaching and applying to jobs. And I was also working at this design firm. So doing all of that and taking a little bit of the pressure off of my art practice for a little bit and letting me focus on trying to find like employment, being fully aware of the student loan situation. This was right before the economic crisis and the recession. And granted, I was able to land a job right before that happened, and even more fortunate that I was able to hold on to that job after everything went down. I started working for Stephen Hall Architects in like late August, beginning of September of 2008. And then we all know what happened right after that.
So is that when you moved to Brooklyn?
Yeah. So, and I've been here ever since, incredibly in the same apartment, which I think is some sort of like New York City record. That's over a decade. Right. It's a very like stereotypical New York City railroad apartment, which is like, it's like a tunnel. Each room connects to the next over a hallway. So, but one of the things about it is that there was an extra room, which meant I could have my studio space in my apartment, which meant no extra $300 to $600 a month, depending on, what you're doing, and where you're doing it. I mean, now you'd be hard pressed to find anything less than $500 a month for a studio space. But knowing, especially at that time when, I first moved here, I wasn't making a ton of money. This apartment was like it was at the top of my price range. It was definitely a little more than I wanted to spend, but I knew that I wouldn't have to rent another studio space. And that was kind of a lifesaver because it would it took some of the pressure off of, another bill, another thing to have to be responsible for. But at the same rate, you could say this is good or bad, but having to walk through my studio every day would remind me, one, to work, but it would also remind me of like how long it maybe was since I last was able to like put in good time there.
Right. Well, that's actually, I wanted to hear more about your studio space or setup. So you have had a studio in your living space since moving to Brooklyn, which was in 2008, you said?
Yes.
Yeah. So can you describe that space a little bit more?
Basically, it's the apartment. When you enter the apartment, you enter in the kitchen. The bathroom's off the kitchen, but from the kitchen, the next room is my studio. The next room is the living room. And then the next room is the bedroom, which is the front of the apartment. There's only windows in the bedroom and in the kitchen. So the two center rooms, the living room and the studio, are windowless, but they have like kind of big archways between it. And I have lots of lighting in there. So it makes it feel a little bit less claustrophobic, but they're not exactly like bright, open, airy spaces.
Right. So downside is not great light, but describe that space for us.
Yeah, sure. So it's about 15 feet long and maybe 12 feet wide, and has a lot of shelving. I primarily work on paper, so I have a big table, big cutting mats. I have a set of flat files. I do some screen printing here. I usually have to go have my screens burned elsewhere. Sometimes I'll sort of do stuff like by cutting films and like printing directly. But I do screen print it here still. So I have screens and there's lots of stacks. There's lots of stacks of things. It's all very organized because having to be actively like walking, like whether or not I'm using the space, I am in the space every single day. And if it's a mess, it drives me insane. So I definitely let myself get messy while I'm working just because it's close quarters. Stuff is going to, papers are going to end up places, things are going to get all over. But generally, I keep it pretty buttoned up. I like to keep the table as clear as possible because that keeps me working. But yeah, I have a big set of shelves. I have one wall that has basically like a row of clips across it so that I can hang stuff as I'm working. And then I have, I guess what could be best described as a clothesline that I can take down so you don't always have to have this line running across. But it's the best impromptu drying rack I've ever come up with in this space. So I basically run the clothesline when I'm printing, and I can hang prints as I go. I never print that many things because there's just no room to. Like, you can't do more than like 10 prints. But I've never been a big edition maker to begin with, so it all works out. But yeah, it's pretty tidy. It has to be.
Yeah, I mean, and there are definitely pros and cons of having a studio, in your home versus separately. And it sounds like this works well. But are there do you ever envision a time when would you prefer to have a private studio kind of outside of your home? Like, are there any kind of cons that you see?
Yeah. Totally agree. There are pros and cons. I love the sort of immediacy I have to accessing this space, because sometimes I'll just be sitting on the couch, watching TV, and then I'll be like, oh, I really want to make, if something pops in my brain, I will just get up and make it, or at least sort of prepare myself for it. Where if my space was elsewhere, I would have to be much more conscientious about denoting time to go to that space. So there's part of me that would love to have a separate space, mostly to sort of alleviate the amount of stuff in my apartment right now. Like, it would be nice just to have less things in this space. So there's that part that I kind of daydream about, but and also just having the freedom to really take over a space and not always have to keep everything perfectly tidy all the time. I also have a cat, and there's no way to keep her out of the space. That's also part of the reason why I have to always put things away when I'm done, because you never know when she's going to just jump on things or knock things over or throw up on them. So Yeah, I definitely daydream about having a separate space. It's something that I would love. Again, it's just like the money thing really, there's yet to be a reason that where the cost, the desire outweighed the cost rather. Like it's just right now it's like I don't want to spend the money on it when I still have the space. If we needed the space for something else, I would consider other options.
Yeah, I would imagine too. I mean, you living in New York, unlike me out here in sunny California, you have winter. And so that always seems to me as like if I had to like bundle up and like trek across the city to, or, even if it wasn't that far, I think I'd be much less inclined to go.
Nearby that I could go for, but still getting out there. And also like most studios are notoriously just like bad. They're too cold, too warm. Like, it's just the HVAC's always a nightmare. I don't think I've been in anybody's studio that I felt like, wow, this is a really comfortable place to be in January.
Right.
So that's always a crapshoot. And that goes into like money. If you pay more, you might have a space that has better ventilation and, better insulation and all that stuff. But it's like, yeah, if you're trying to cheap out on it, chances are you're going to be in a freezing warehouse somewhere. But, obviously there's everything on either end of the spectrum and in between available. It's just, there's always someone looking for someone to like share a studio space. So I feel like if I really wanted to do it, I could. But yeah, right now it's like, I'd rather save the money until I feel like I maybe need to use the space for something else, or we really hit critical mass in the apartment. But I feel like also whatever space you're in, you sort of make work that lends itself to it. Like right now, my table is maybe, 50 inches wide by, 36 inches deep. And that's about as big as I work. And that just kind of is what it is. And it's not that I don't want to make bigger things, but it's like, that's what I can make in this space. So that's what I've been doing. And I'm kind of okay with that. Like I've learned, especially over the years of having to work as much and not having as much time for the art making side of things, that I have to almost accept the limits of what I can do at a given time. And if that means that I'm only making small watercolors or like little drawings for a couple years, because that's just what I can make in this space until I can find a better location or go to a residency or something like that, then that's just what I'll make. And I have to, find ways to sort of work with that. So in some ways I really embraced working smaller in the last few years. Not that I want to impose limits on what I'm making, but I tend to respond well to structure in my practice. So like having this limitation to primarily also, working with stuff that isn't particularly toxic or has a lot of fumes. Not that I ever really worked that much with stuff like with, resins or oil paints or anything like that, but sort of limiting myself to like paper and X-Acto knives and water-based inks and that type of thing has been kind of great. It's just like, what can I do with this? I've found my way into some really interesting work by sort of, having a new set of rules to work with.
I mean, obviously your time is very constrained right now, but I'm finding that's a common thread as well, as most people are working out of their homes or small studios. And that is a constraint that has actually been pretty productive for most people, it seems like. Yeah. Limits and constraints can actually be really beneficial, I think.
I totally agree. I also have found that, and this is something I knew about myself, like probably back into like high school and college, but I know that I work really well with a deadline. And I knew that even having that kind of, limitation imposed on you, like this has to be done by this time, would often make me produce pretty good work. And that the pressure that would create often would facilitate, a good final product. And while, having less space or less time is another constraint that you could look at as a problematic thing, and less time to sort of embrace your practice. But it kind of has forced me to make the most of the times that I can. So the way that I've managed to work over the years is that I don't really have a steady practice where like I'm in here every day or even every week or even every month. Sometimes I really work in these bursts. I tend to, ruminate on ideas and create designs. And I work kind of equal parts digitally and by hand. So like a huge amount of my time is just spent on my computer trying to sort out stuff and building things in Illustrator and laying things out and sort of planning and researching and digging up images and looking at my own photography and just sort of like speculating on what I've gathered, like my like assessment of data, if you will, and then building projects out of that. And then the actual physical manifestation of those ideas into an art object happens like maybe 4 times a year. But in those 4 times a year, it's like I will work for like a week straight.
As we've heard up to this point, Janine's current day job as an archivist is well aligned with her creative interests within her studio practice. But when your day job becomes more of a career, you might find yourself at a point where your studio time is further limited in order to develop the more professional aspects of how you make a living.
One of the things that happened also is that, so I worked for this architect for 7.5 years, and it was amazing. But I realized that as I was working, technically as an archivist, that I was sort of missing the official degree to do what I was doing. And while it wasn't a thing that I had to necessarily do, I knew that it would be a limitation in the future if I was really like committing to this path. So when I moved on to my new job, which is the job I have had now for the last 3 years, I'm the head of archives at the Noguchi Museum, I knew that I had to go back to school, which was like one more thing on top of everything else. Like already juggling art and work was crazy. I think part of it was that I did not remember how much work school was. All I have left is I have to write my thesis, which I'll be officially done in May. But I went back to school in 2016 to do a master's of library and information science, which has been pretty exciting. It's been interesting. It's just like, it's what I've been doing for a decade. So it's been this sort of interesting, like meta practice of like, okay, I'm in class for things I've been doing. And in some respects, I know as much as the professors, and others I absolutely do not. It's not like I don't respect or value the time that I've spent there. Otherwise I would not have invested as much time, effort, money, all the things into it. It's been great for my professional development. It's definitely given me a lot more focus to what I was doing. And I've definitely learned things too, especially like in terms of like the digital landscape. And this is also what my art practice is about in a lot of ways too. So in another way, it was actually sort of giving me more information to work with, just less time to deal with any of it, but making me more aware of sort of how we process information, how information is created, how information is stored, how information is accessed. That's basically what I've been studying for the last 3 years in different capacities. And then while I've been at Noguchi, one of the things we've been doing has been digitizing the entire archive and building a database for it and working with developers to build this database. And I've learned so much in the last few years on a subject I thought I really knew a ton about, which goes to show you just how much there is to always learn. So I don't regret the time spent going back to school and doing this, especially because I feel like I am really committing to this career path, which I entirely intend to do side by side with my own art practice. And the thing that I've done with my career in terms of archiving is that I have focused it specifically on art, architecture, and design collections, which is where my art practice like lays also. It's just, it's sort of this intersection of these three areas of creativity.
Janine and I discussed the MLS degree versus having gone to grad school previously for art for about another 5 minutes. Look for that bonus mini episode wherever you listen to the podcast.
In some ways, I am really happy I did it at this time, but it did impose a lot of challenges on the art side of my life because I did not remember how much work school was. I think I had sort of diminished in my mind what I thought doing an MLS was. I didn't think it was going to be nearly as hard as an MFA, so I was like, I'm going to have all this time, which is completely wrong. It was not as hard as an MFA, obviously, but it was insanely time consuming, and I found that I could only find time to make work like during Christmas break and during the summer break, and basically when school was back in session, nothing was happening short of like some of the digital research that I was talking about earlier. But in terms of like art production, it all happened like in two giant clusters in like
the summer. So just to be clear, I mean you've been working full time this whole time.
Yes.
Okay. And I feel like you're addressing some questions that I had kind of later on about, other ways that your day job and I think this kind of additional formal training affect your creative practice and vice versa. Like it sounds like even though this obviously takes up a lot of that already sort of small chunk of time you have to make your artwork, you have been able to integrate those interests a little bit more than I think some other folks that I'm talking to. And you don't refer to your job as a day job. You're talking about your career. And I think you can do that maybe potentially because they are integrated. Like, How do you, would you agree with that? Like, is that intentional?
Absolutely. And I understand the opposite approach too, because I definitely have friends that have more of a day job that's completely separate, like work in the food industry or do something that is like nothing to do with their art at all, but they do it so that they have the means to make the art that they want when they want it outside of that job. I don't know exactly how I ended up making things work the way that I did. Maybe because I think both in college and in grad school, I always had jobs, granted I had some random stuff mixed in as I described before, but I always had jobs that were really tied into some sort of arts administrative path. And I think I always expected that I was going to work. And in my mind, I wanted to make sure that if I was going to have to work full time, which I was pretty certain I was going to, given my student loans, that I did something that I felt good about, that I felt like a long-term viability with. Which isn't to say that doing something completely separate does not have long-term viability, because that's absolutely not true. But I wanted something that could sort of do double duty, because it felt like the only way I could sort of stay present in my art making was to make sure that I could kind of think about it all the time. So even though my day job, I'm not sitting around all day thinking about like what art I'm going to make and how I'm going to turn when I'm doing it work into an art project. It's not that at all. It's just that I found that in the two jobs that I've had since grad school, both the architect and then at the Noguchi Museum, that in both places I was constantly exposed to ideas and materials and things that I maybe wouldn't have encountered, processes, like you name it, that I maybe wouldn't have encountered on my own. So it sort of would facilitate the research side of my practice, which has always been a huge part of what I do. Like in some ways, the art making, and while I am like an object-based artist, like I do produce things, the idea has always been the bigger part of it for me. The process, the like physicality of it has kind of been secondary. As much as I like love the things that I make, I definitely spend more time thinking about it and planning than I do making it. Like most of the stuff I make, I can make in one sitting. It's something that I was able to feel like I was remaining active and like present in at least the like conceptual side of what I was doing, even if I wasn't actually like in a studio making things. That if I was writing and keeping notes and drafting plans and keeping lists of the things that I wanted to make, and so that when I was actually ready to be in my studio and make something, that I could churn out like 5 or 6 things. And that has really worked for me in like the post MFA landscape. That has been the only way I've been able to balance having a demanding full-time job and still being like active in the art world in some way. And I'm not even as active as I would like hope to be or want to be, but at least I feel like I'm doing something.
Yeah, to me, it seems like that's probably a big piece for you as well. Like you are active in your community, not only in how you're making your own work, but in what you have been doing as your job.
Totally. And you have to be. If there's anything I can say about like how the art community in New York has been in terms of like how receptive it is, it's like, it's 1,000% you get what you give. So if you're really active and present and you go to a lot of openings and you talk to people and you go and have studio visits and you invite people to your studio and you go to like, the more you do that, the more things happen. That's just what it is. It's like ignoring the FOMO, like fear of missing out side of things. Like initially, especially with the school stuff, I could not keep up with what I used to do in terms of like the openings I went to and the stuff I was producing. Like I just couldn't keep up with any of it. And initially I was really, really unhappy about it. And I was like, why did I do this? Like, why did I sign myself up for this? And then I sort of let go a little bit and was just like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to finish it. And no, I can't go to every opening and I can't be there for everything, but I know how to prioritize. I spend every minute of every day basically like prioritizing my tasks, like prioritizing what other people are working on, what I'm working on. So like all day long, I'm trying to make the right decision about like what has to happen first. And I had to sort of translate that into my personal life too, whether it was seeing friends or going to an opening or finding time in the studio or applying for something, and just sort of make peace with it and know that like it was going to end eventually, whether just for the semester when I would have time over a break to do something, or now that school is pretty much done with the exception of one final task
giant paper.
Knowing that I was really close to being done has pushed me to be even more active in my studio and to apply to more things and to go to more things and just sort of step it up again. Because as much as I've been able to sort of suppress the FOMO, if you will, there's also a big part of me that still wants to do things and, would get bummed out when I would, be like, oh, all my friends are at this opening.
Yeah. I mean, I think it speaks to a couple of things. One, again, that I think this is a common thread with artists who have obviously like day jobs or careers, is that kind of like the long haul, like you're in it, you're sort of a lifer, like you're going to have periods where you're less productive and you just have to, even though those can be really frustrating, I think just kind of have faith in a way that you're going to get back to it, especially, in your case, I think it's not like you're in this degree that ends indefinitely. Yeah. So I think there's that piece of it. And then also kind of that idea that absence makes the heart grow fonder. Like, I think if you have to take a break from your studio practice, once you're able to get back to it, I think it can kind of refresh like what's going on in there and make for some really good work to come.
Absolutely. One of my personal mottos is it's a marathon, not a sprint. And I have to remind myself constantly that I'm still very much in the emerging part of my art career, if you will. I know that there is a lot of time left to make a lot of things happen. And every time I go to I went to the Agnes Martin retrospective and it's she didn't make work for years, for a chunk of time in the middle of, of her life. It's that kind of stuff is normal. And I have to remember that, life happens and things happen, people move, you change jobs, you change careers, you go back to school, you have a kid, things like that completely can, disrupt, for lack of a better term, what your life is. A lot of this is the stuff you have to tell yourself to just sort of keep the motivation and not feel totally down about the fact that you're not making things, especially coming out of grad school. It's you're never going to have the luxury of time that you did in grad school to just focus. It's the most narcissistic, myopic, self-involved time of your life. And it's amazing. And I'm so lucky that I got to have that time, especially in the program that we were at. 3 years is amazing, but that's not reality, not for most people, at least not for people that, can't afford to. So it's that initial shift, even when I first started my job right out of MFA, the first year that I was working for the architect, I barely made anything for almost, I think, 8 or 9 months right after school, because one, I was a little burnt out, but two, is just I was just how do I work full time? What is this? And now it's okay, now you're used to it. You can figure out these moments and just sort of accept that this is what it is for now. And you kind of find a way to keep persevering and working through it, and know that maybe there'll be more time down the line. Maybe you'll be able to go to a residency. Maybe there's a point where I can work part-time. I don't know. And look forward to the possibility of that. But until then, what do I have to do to sort of keep things moving if my desire is to still remain somewhat active? I don't know.
Yeah. I think also, Agnes Martin is a great example of somebody who had a bunch of different jobs. And, it's, of course, it's easy to look at a retrospective. It's hard when you're living that and you're in the midst of one of those down periods. But it also makes me think of Werner Herzog's classic advice to aspiring filmmakers to don't go to film school, don't become a production assistant, go become a plumber, live life, have a bunch of jobs. And because, life gets in the way, but it also, if you don't have those experiences, what's informing your work, so I think that's another angle to look at it in a potentially productive way.
Totally. And I think that also makes the argument for, for those people that are working the completely unrelated job. You don't know how these things are going to influence you. And, I've heard that Herzog advice, and I've heard it also from another, I feel I've heard it for writers too. It's just you sort of write what you know. So why not experience life and have something to write about? And I feel it absolutely applies the same way to sort of a more visual based practice. And in my case, in terms of what I chose to do and how things landed, it was really made a conscientious choice to work in the architect, that I made a choice to work in architecture. So I would at least sort of have fodder, something to think about. it ended up being even more than I expected in terms of like how much it influenced me, because a lot of what ended up coming out of that, I was just like, oh, I can make things in a different way. I can use a laser cutter. I can think about, spatial differences and stuff that like stuff that's like more part of an architectural discourse that still fit into what I was thinking about art wise. If anything, it's been a good thing to sort of have this other life, so to speak. The downside absolutely is the time thing. Sort of hypothetically imagine, like, if I didn't have to work, like if I was really, really wealthy, like would I still want to work? And I think I would. Maybe not full time, but I think I would, if I would still want to do something to like give me some way to like immerse myself in something else outside of like the vacuum of my studio. Even when you do bring people in, even when you do have studio visits, like you're still in this vacuum, and that is also art school too. It's like art school is not reality. It's an incredible experience, but it's not reality at all.
Yeah. I mean, in art school, not only do you have the luxury of time, but you also have the kind of outside motivation, I guess, like you have the expectation that you're going to make work at a certain rate that I think is also not super realistic outside of art school.
No,
it doesn't always, it's not just time. I feel like it's also this kind of artificial structure of like expectation and deadlines and which when you get out of school, then all of a sudden, all of that kind of like slows down and stretches out, and you might not have that expectation or deadline. Yeah. And then you have to kind of create those constraints for yourself or, apply to shows. So which actually I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about showing your work, both, do you have time to submit your work to shows, your artwork? Do you apply for grants? Have you found other ways to get your art out kind of into the world? And then, the flip side of that, of course, now with social media, like, and again, all of this under the umbrella of not having a whole lot of time to begin with, do you have a strategy around social media, considering you have such limited studio time in the first place? I guess, how do you prioritize both of those things, like both trying to get your work seen in a, physical context, and how does social media figure into all this for you?
So I wasn't really that early of an adapter to Instagram, and I was a little skeptical of it at first, but it really is the only social media that I actively use. And I noticed early on that it was really great for people in creative practices. I actually started noticing it primarily for like tattoo artists, that really amazing followings are just sort of developing out of Instagram accounts. And I was like, wait a second. And then everybody uses it for their creative means, but this is like, I don't even know how many years ago this was. That was sort of what first like clicked in my brain as like, oh wait, this could actually be a great tool. There is the downside to it, because everyone's always putting forward their like curated best view of themselves. So you're like, everyone's doing things but me. Everyone's in shows but me. So if you can kind of get past that aspect of it, I do actually like to use it a lot to show works in progress. And when I'm done with something that I'm really happy about, I definitely post it, and I use my Instagram pretty actively.
Almost all of the artists I speak with for the podcast are consistent in their responses to this question. With such limited time outside of paid work, despite having perhaps more financial resources to put toward this than someone who's working less, artists and offices must be incredibly selective about the shows and other opportunities they take the time to apply to.
I do. I'm really, really picky about what I will apply for at this point, just because time is so limited. So I try, obviously nothing's a sure thing. And I, like everyone, get more than my fair share of rejection. But I do try to be really careful about what I choose to apply for, and that it's something that I would really want to give my time to, or that I have work that really could be a good fit for it. Try to take studio visits with people. There's a couple curators that I've sort of met over the years that have remained sort of interested in my work. I try to apply to residencies when I can. If there's one that fits into my schedule, generally that means it has to be like 1 or 2 weeks long, and I'm going to be giving up my vacation time to go to it. But so I don't do that too often. It's something that happens like once every few years. And when I do feel confident about the work I've produced, I definitely try to bring in studio visits. I really will take any opportunity that comes my way. I really pleasantly surprised before, where I thought I was having like a random studio visit and found out that someone wanted to like put my work in a show, and they already had like envisioned a place for it. I've definitely had times that I thought I was having a studio visit because I thought I was going to get a show, and I like never heard anything after. I always sort of expect the worst, so I can be pleasantly surprised when things do work out. I do make a concerted effort to apply to things and to seek out opportunities. And I'm also not that hard on myself when I just don't have time to do it. there's always some other opportunity. So I just try to make sure that when I do have the time, that I just find a way and get it done. I try not to pay for things too often. I get frustrated because, again, like back to the conversation earlier about, the expectation that artists should work for free. There's often this expectation that artists have to pay to show their work. And I understand that sometimes it is, artists that are running spaces or different portals where it has to stay afloat. So they need a fee in order to run things. I get that. Absolutely. But I feel like that often is sort of abused too. So I try to be careful in making my selections. Like, do I really want to pay $45 to be rejected right now?
Right, exactly.
We'll pay for the occasional entry fee if it's within reason. And I think it's like a really reputable place and the money is going to something good, like people running the space. I get that for sure.
Like other artists and offices that work there.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
A lot of it, I think, and I'm struck by this talking to you, is our attitude going into things like this. Like, how do you see your day job as pulling away from your studio time or potentially supporting it in ways that aren't just financial? So I think all of this, you can kind of look at it in that way of like, not to be too rosy glasses about it, but a lot of it, I think you have to kind of go into it with a positive attitude. Otherwise it's going to crush you. Or
else it's just totally depressing because I feel like, especially in cities like, New York or DC or San Francisco, like where people work really, really hard. And this expectation, this pace of things is just, it's so intense here. And the expectation is that you are going to work your ass off and everyone is hustling and everyone's trying to make something happen. Otherwise, you should live somewhere that is less stressful. That's sort of the general take of like, why are you here? And I can get really caught up in that, and working that hard it can be really tiring and really frustrating. And I think you kind of have to keep a positive outlook about it. Otherwise it's almost too depressing. It's like, I could maybe live somewhere and it would be easier and I'd probably save more money. And if I was in a less competitive city, I probably would have a solo show right now. But at the same rate, like I like the intensity. I like the dialogue. I like all the things that are happening here too. So, those are, and also the accessibility to just like incredible art and things happening that you can expose yourself to that, might not be in other places quite in such a great quantity, I guess.
We're getting to the end of the interview. This is when I ask artists if what they're doing now, in terms of the work they do for pay and their creative work, is sustainable. Does this idea that artists can't not make art overly romanticize just how challenging that juggling act can be? Can you imagine how you'd use your hours if fewer of them had to be spent at work?
Yeah, I know in an ideal world, it would be amazing if I didn't have to work, but I also feel like I might be a little bit bored, which is part of why what I was saying before, like, even if I had millions of dollars in the bank, I would still probably want to do something, maybe not quite to the intensity that I'm doing now. It would be nice to have more time and energy and space to focus on creating art, but I still feel like somewhere in there, I would want to be sort of involved somewhere else. But in terms of like, this sort of romanticization that you describe, like, I think it's kind of the case. I think that's part of what keeps everyone's like chin up through all of it, is just like, this is somehow helping. But I feel like for me, in order for that to add up, I had to find a way for that day job, that hustle, to sort of feed into the creative side. I don't think I could really separate the two. And like, what I do day to day at work is not anywhere in the realm of art making, but it is still research oriented and about an artist practice. No job is ever going to totally line up. And I don't know if I necessarily would, because I definitely have friends that have like studio assistant jobs where like they do make art all day, every day for someone else. Again, like I said before, that I never sort of expected to be working full time as an artist. I never expect that I'm going to be like fully committed to ever just making my art and living off my art practice. Yeah, it takes away the luster really quickly. And you're like, no, because even the people that are making a living off of their art practice are still have these limitations, still have all these responsibilities, still have all these other things that take up a ton of their time, and very little of it, or at least not as much as you think, is probably spent on like the joy of creating. Even if I'm never a successful artist, I feel like by separating my work from my art practice, even though my work does feed into my art practice, but having it be two separate entities means that there's a lot of freedom in my art making. It's like I can kind of make what I want because there's no gallery or collector or entity that's like trying to make me make a certain type of thing because that's what they want to sell. And that could directly play into your financial success as an artist. So my goal right now is like, it's on a much smaller scale, but it really is sort of just get back to where I felt I was a few years ago in terms of how my work is being shown and the attention I was getting within, the art scene that I'm active with here and going to maybe another residency and sort of like doing some of the stuff that was a little bit more normal for me relative, like basically normalizing again to what for the 7-8 years after my MFA that I was doing, that I was kind of moving along at a really what I thought was a good pace, and then that got kind of subdued and pushed back because of school. So yeah, goal number one is just kind of getting back to where I was, and I feel like I'm present. So as soon as like you kind of get the momentum moving and things are happening again, it just starts to accumulate. So that's basically it. I feel like I just want to get back to where I was, because when I do that, I feel like things they'll just start to happen again. And, there's obviously going to be a lot of, there's always going to be rejections and failures in there too. But as long as a couple things happen a year, like my idea of success at this point is so much smaller than I think I would have thought, like, back in 2008, like fresh out of grad school. Like I look at my CV and it's like 2007, 2008, I'm in like 12 exhibitions. And it's like 2009, there's like one. So it's like, you just got to sort of, reevaluate where you're at and where your priorities are. And yeah, there's other things happening. And like I always care about making art, and I always care about art being a part of my life, but I don't know how much time that takes up in my day-to-day varies wildly from day to day, from month to month, and from year to year. And I think really early on, like when I first started that first job right out of grad school, that realization that like I could barely find time to make anything for like 8 months was this really big dose of reality about like, okay, you're going to have to really change the way you think about your time and what you're doing and find different ways to motivate yourself. That was also another moment of realizing like, I'm really good with the deadline. If I know something, if I really want to make something happen and this is when it has to be done by, I'll do it. So that kind of stuff, just keeping yourself accountable in whatever way you can in proportion to what's happening in your life, and just kind of being okay with it, because in the end, yeah, it's a marathon, not a sprint.
More information about Janine can be found at artistsandoffices.com. On the next episode of the podcast, I speak with Christopher Thomas Ford, a Long Beach-based artist who juggles his studio practice with his day job as a preparator's assistant at a Los Angeles art museum. Artists and Offices is produced and edited by me, Rebecca Bird Grigsby. Intro music is provided by Mr. Neat Beats. Show notes and additional episodes can be found at artistsandoffices.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing to the podcast on iTunes and leave the show a rating or review. This will help the podcast connect with even more artists and offices. Thank you so much for listening.
And my only reference point for the railroad apartment is the movie Last Days of Disco.
Oh, yeah.
Is that accurate? Is that about, because that's like a big deal with that apartment that they get and you have to like walk through.
Yes.
It's like not ideal because they have to walk through each other's rooms. But is that typical?
Totally. I love that movie. It's totally accurate.